I think I was invited down primarily because this just came out. It's a biography of Srila Prabhupada called Swami in a Strange Land. This is the strange land right here. And when I first became a devotee in London, my great pleasure was to have had the opportunity to travel with Srila Prabhupada. And over the years, that I think is really the best thing that I can offer you is those experiences. So there'll be some stories throughout the time that we're together here this afternoon, as many as you like. I used to play a game with my son, who's now a disciple of Radhanath Swami. He would name an object, and I had to come up with a Prabhupada story. So he'd say apple, so I'd have to come up with a story about Srila Prabhupada. Let me not make any assumptions. Is there anyone here today who is only coming to a Krishna community for the first time? Can I see by a show of... So everyone's old school here. All right, great. So there are certain things I can talk about and you'll understand what I mean. So while we're waiting for the technology to come back on, I do see some old friends here. Maladi was one of the first devotees I ever met. Thank you. If I haven't thanked you before, yes. Oh, welcome. Can't quite see you there. First-time students means that you're unfamiliar with Krishna consciousness and the Krishna society? Oh, so you've had some exposure to the theology and the basic ideas of Krishna consciousness? Okay. I think you'll have some fun with this program, too. So I was 19 when I first met Maladi back in the London Temple. And I remember that first week, the devotees were recording with George Harrison, the Radha Krishna Temple album. And they asked me about myself, and I said, well, I'm a student at the Sorbonne in Paris. And, well, what else? Well, I play organ in a college, rock band. Really? Come with us. Where are we going? You'll see. So we got into that. Remember that Volkswagen minibus? It was horrible. Probably the worst car ever invented. So we're kind of going like this back and forth. About 15 minutes later, we show up, the door of the van opens, and there's a door with the number 3 on it. I think to myself, 3? This is 3 Savile Row. This is Beatles headquarters here. Now, for those of you who aren't old enough to remember this, as a 19-year-old in 1969, 1970, the Beatles were at their peak. This was really at the height of, they were just coming out with some of their most important work, the White Album, Abbey Road album. And whatever they were into, we were into. We wanted to know what they were doing. They were the first ones to experiment with hallucinogens. They were meeting every important person in the world. And every album was an experiment with some really deep, fascinating ideas. And those of us who remember those days, remember when a new Beatles album came out. We remember where we were. We remember what we were doing, who we were with, and listening to the lyrics of those songs was a deeply meaningful thing for us. I remember hearing this one line, and in the end, the love you take is equal to the love you make. And I nearly fainted. That was that kind of memorable lyrics that they were coming up with. How are we doing? Let's see what happens. Okay. Hold on. What about getting another computer? Well, I don't think it's the computer. All right, so I'll tell you some more stories while we're waiting. So we go downstairs, and sure enough, there's George Harrison down there. He's got neck beads on, and he's got a hair down to his waist, and he's hugging Shyam Sundar and some of the other devotees, and they're pointing to me and saying, he plays keyboard. So George comes over and hands me a harmonium, and he says, just play along, you'll pick it up. So I start playing, and we were recording Govinda Jaya Jaya. Yamuna's chanting, Govinda Jaya Jaya Gopala Jaya. So I'm pumping away on this thing, and I'm thinking, okay, if I stay with these people, I get God and the Beatles. Okay, I'm in. That was a nice way to kind of get started in Krishna consciousness. And George was a wonderful guy. As long as you treated him like a human being, everything was fine. He would talk with you and had just the nicest, warmest person you could ever meet. If you looked at him with that little twinkle in your eye, like, well, I'm with a Beatle, he would walk the other way. He did not want to reinforce that Maya identity anymore. It was just that part of his life was over. Remember, he just didn't want to have anything to do with that. So he sent us around. We were doing outdoor concerts and playing festivals all over the place. And are we there? Aha. Well, now let's see how we can get the full image up there. That's a different question. Well, there we go. Congratulations. Thank you. Oh, that's all right. Do you mind if I sit? That way I can gesticulate.
I won't lose it. Don't worry about it.
We good?
We're good.
Okay. So here's a bunch of pictures of me with Prabhupada. This is just to impress you. That's the only reason for putting this together. That's in the Paris temple in the upper left. That's with the mayor of Paris in the upper right. And down below is with George Harrison. There's Malati there as a young'un with Shyam Sundar and other devotees there at recording the Hare Krishna mantra, I think, or Govindam, or one of those. And so over the years I've served in a number of capacities. I'm not near a temple these days. I live on Long Island. And the nearest temple is the Bhakti Center in New York City. That's about 45 minutes away. However, the devotees being very kind, they engage me in different services. And currently I'm working with this wonderful group of devotees on the Temple of the Vedic Planetarium, determining how to embody the fifth canto of the Srimad Bhagavatam in physical space. How do we represent the Vedic cosmology, which is essentially an invisible universe? There's the universe we can see, the empiric universe. We might call it the Siddhantic universe, the universe of planets and stars that we can perceive with telescopes and so on. And then there's another universe described in the Bhagavatam, which we could call the Puranic universe. That's the divine universe, the spiritual layout of creation that is only perceived through revelation and through deep meditation and very deep realization, purification, sacrifice. These other dimensions of reality are revealed. So here's where you see me most of the time. These days I teach on the undergraduate level at Hofstra University in New York, or adult education courses. And the devotees in different temples where I'm invited to speak are aware that I'm in these venues where I'm challenged to present Prabhupada and Prabhupada's teachings to an uninitiated audience, to people who may have no understanding of Krishna consciousness or who Srila Prabhupada is. So before I get into Prabhupada's story and how I would present Prabhupada, let's say, to a community group or a university audience or wherever it may be, let me just show you a couple of flyers for programs that these are programs that we do up in New York at a place called Jivamukti Yoga School. On the left side, that's Herbie Hancock. And improvisation in jazz is a very powerful metaphor for the progressive stages of our love of God. Many great jazz musicians started out in classical music. Wynton Marsalis and others were classical musicians. You master the basics first, and then you can begin to improvise. You know, like one of my favorite jazz pianists is Bill Evans. When you listen to a Bill Evans album like Conversations with Myself, and he's sitting down and he's playing, he's not thinking, well, I'm going to put this finger here and that finger there, and then I'm going to go this chord and that chord. That's all happening very spontaneously, and his mind and heart are free to explore new regions of expression. Right? There's something like that that happens in Krishna consciousness. The more we master the basics, the more we become, by second nature, capable of leading a clean, healthy, devotional life, the more our hearts and minds become free to begin exploring new ways of expressing our love for Krishna. The 60s is always a big topic. People in our generation, if you don't mind me saying so, will look back and remember. I remember when I was a teenager back in the 60s, you know, where did that energy go? What happened? We were so, you know, Bonnie Raitt has a song out there now called, you know, now you're mystified and you're standing with us who used to rule the world. What happened to it? Where did it all go? There was an energy there in the 60s, stretching new muscles, discovering new dimensions of what we can be in society as a force for change, and then it all dissipated. So a lot of people in their, you know, baby boomer years are open to understanding where did that energy go. Or to jump to the bottom line, it's still there. Right? The message that in this program would be, it's just beginning. Right? We're still here. We're not so young as to be stupid anymore. And we're really arguably entering the most productive years of our life. So that's what that one is. I do this one because my background is Holocaust studies. This week is Holocaust Remembrance Week. And one of the things that has always challenged us since World War II is, how was it possible for humans to treat other humans in this way? The horrors of the concentration camp, when they were first made public, the Army Signal Corps came into the concentration camps after liberation in April and May of 1945. And what they discovered there was printed photographs and newsreels. And there was this hue and cry to bring the perpetrators of these crimes to justice. And ever since then, 70, however many years ago, we've been asking ourselves, how is it possible for humans to fall so far? And so in this particular program, we look at the lives of three people who were raised in deeply spiritual traditions. We look at the life of Dietrich Bonhoeffer, who was a German theologian, a pastor, who was teaching in New York at Union Theological Seminary in the 1930s, and who decided that as a Christian, it was his responsibility to go back to Germany, to be with his people, and to do something to try and stop the horror. Very interesting perspective that spiritual life, and we can relate to this, is not selfish salvationism. We're not in Krishna consciousness. Prabhupada never said, chant Hare Krishna, go back to Godhead, and to hell with the rest of the world. You know, our job is to get involved with the work of moving all of humanity forward, and that means understanding what are the challenges that other people face in their life. We look at a second mystic, if you will. His name was Rabbi Kalman Shapiro. He was the rabbi of the Warsaw Ghetto, the son of the former Warsaw Ghetto rabbi. Kalman Shapiro wrote a book called Creating Community, and he hid it in the bricks of the ruins of the Warsaw Ghetto with a note on top. It was written in Hebrew. If anyone finds this after the war, please send it to my family in Palestine, it was then. It was found as they were cleaning up the ghetto after the liberation. And this manuscript was published first in Hebrew in Israel, and then maybe 15 years ago in English. It's the most amazing thing. Here he is with all of this destruction and murder and starvation and torture and the worst possible things going on around him. Not once does he get distracted in his writing from describing how to lead a spiritual life. Stay clean, keep good company, say your prayers, study scripture. He was focused like a laser on the real essence of the real liberation, which is not the liberation of the body or the society around us, but the soul from the shackles of matter, and he knew that. And we look at a third person who was a Sufi princess named Noor. Noor Inayat Khan was the daughter of Hazrat Khan, the last great Sufi mogul of South India. He was the last one to fight off the British. He was known as the Tiger Sultan. And he married the cousin of the woman who founded Christian Science from Albuquerque. So you have this beautiful blonde-haired, blue-eyed woman and this tall, dark-skinned, handsome mystic. And the result of their union were these 4 gorgeous children. The youngest, Noor, was a beautiful young woman who was enlisted by the British Secret Service, the Bletchley Park crowd, to be dropped under cover of night into Nazi-occupied Paris, where she detoured the Nazis away from the actual invasion of the Allies at Normandy Beach by sending out false radio signals. So she's credited with having actually helped win the war. She was tortured in concentration camp Dachau and then executed with a Luger bullet to the back of her head. Her brother, Pir Vilayat Khan, who was one of the founders of Omega Institute in upstate New York, I had a chance to interview him, and he said that after the war he went to concentration camp Dachau and met some women who were in the same room where his sister had been tortured. And she told him the most amazing story, that she was so, I mean, the Sufis grow up reading Bhagavad Gita and the stories of Ramayana and Mahabharata. You know, she was reading children's stories from Ramayana on French radio before the war. She told her captors and her torturers, "You can do whatever you want to my body, but you cannot touch my soul." So in this particular program, we look at the difference between people who are raised in what we might call a Krishna conscious-like environment, how they process these horrible experiences, as opposed to people who didn't have that training when they were growing up. We also sometimes do film programs, like to look at the verse from 3rd chapter Bhagavad Gita that talks about how people become mesmerized by material accomplishment. We'll look at a clip from F. Scott Fitzgerald's, the film adaptation of Fitzgerald's book, The Great Gatsby. Gatsby, who was the epitome of materialism, you know, someone who just had to have that recognition of himself, almost Ravana-like. You know, here's Ravana, who was desperate to be recognized as a deva. I mean, that was Ravana's great quest, was to be a god. And he knew he couldn't be. By psychic disposition, by psychology, by biology, he was incapable of living that kind of a godly life. So ultimately is what brought him down, was his own frustration over not being able to be something more than he was capable of being. Then, of course, we'll have a series on Ramayana. We'll bring in dancers and music and drama, and so that's a lot of fun. Peter Brook directed a 8-hour version of Mahabharata that was staged in Brooklyn at the Brooklyn Academy of Music back in the 1980s. That's also available on DVD. I recommend it to you. It's quite a well-done production. We'll look at those clips as a way of bringing people inside the story of Bhagavad Gita. People ask questions like, how can a sacred text such as the Gita end in war? Well, the answer is, if you understand the larger context of the Mahabharata battle, you can understand that war was the last resort. The Pandavas tried everything: mediation, dialogue, negotiation, compromise. At one point they told Krishna as their messenger, give them the kingdom, let them keep it. Just give us 5 villages. And the Kauravas were so envious, their response was, we would not give you enough land in which to drive a pin. And at that point, war was inevitable. So the Bhagavad Gita does not advocate war. That's a misunderstanding. So by understanding the greater story of Mahabharata, these points can be clarified. Then we'll have series on mysticism or on the Gita. Sometimes devotee artists will come and we'll talk about art. as a path to enlightenment, art as a path to spiritual realization, kirtans, of course. And this is a wonderful program. We go down to Myrtle Beach, South Carolina, where a friend of mine runs the Tigers Wildlife Preserve. This is the largest community of rare and endangered tigers in the world. There are nearly 100 tigers there, and they don't believe in cages. The person who runs this place, Bhagavan Antal, is a disciple of Swami Satchidananda, and he and his staff relate to the animals there, tigers, pumas, cheetahs, orangutan, you name it. There's dozens of species there. From a yogic perspective, not as wild creatures, but as souls inhabiting other than human form. And that kind of care and attention and love and affection changes the consciousness of these creatures so that they're no longer predatory. They're being fed the most healthy diet. They're cared for. They're groomed. They know they're loved. And so that dangerous part of the nature abates, and other parts of their character rise to the surface. Curiosity, room for interspecies friendships, room for interaction with humans. And it's life transforming to hold some of these amazing, beautiful creatures in your arms. It's an experience that's fading rapidly into memory. There are only 3,000 tigers left in the world, and they may be extinct within the next 10 years. The great apes, you will find that there is room for friendship if the consciousness is recognized. I once talked with Jane Goodall and asked her, what's it like having spent so many years with the chimpanzees? And she says, when you stare into the eyes of these creatures and you see consciousness at work and you project to them your respect for them as divine creatures, do you not think that they will recognize that? And when they recognize that, do you not think that that will then go back to their tribe, to their group, to their community, and it will be perpetuated from then on? She was one of the most spiritual people I think I've ever spoken with, precisely because she does not represent a religious community. She doesn't have to defend any institutional interests. She speaks of the forest as a cathedral. And then that's an absolutely beautiful thing to hear her speak. Then we have programs, retreats on Long Island. There's one coming up this June. If anyone's interested, come see me afterwards. And so here we come to Prabhupada's stories. How are we doing so far? Is that okay? Any questions about what I've been trying to describe so far about ways to introduce Krishna consciousness in a way that's engaging, that's interesting for people, that reaches them in the world they inhabit? You know, sometimes we'll go to a museum exhibit and the exercise will be, okay, let's look at these Matisse paintings from a Vaishnava point of view. Tell me what you see. It's fascinating, absolutely fascinating what these very sincere people will come up with. And they've never lived in temples. You know, we've done some discussion of Bhagavad Gita, but they'll give impressions, absolutely brilliant insights into art. Or we'll go to the theater and we'll see something, and afterwards we'll talk about it. We took a tour of the High Line in New York and walked and saw some of the architecture of the city. Anyway, just an idea of different ways that Krishna consciousness can be introduced in engaging fashion for people. Right? Okay, so if there's no questions, let's move on to this story of Prabhupada's hero journey. What I'm not going to do is repeat for you the story that's in the book. You got to buy the book to get that story. But that's what's called blatant product placement. But what I will do, I'd like to tell you at least a little bit about what I discovered writing this book. And what I discovered was that, well, first of all, it was a thank you. It was a thank you to Srila Prabhupada. It was meant for the general public. And people asked, did I discover anything new? I think what I discovered most was what it meant that Srila Prabhupada gave an example for us to follow. It was an example of sacrifice. Trying to put this together in a way. How do you describe sacrifice? Sacrifice is not a particularly friendly word, you know, tapas or, you know, yajna. I mean, it has a kind of negative connotation in American culture. Well, you gotta, you know, give up this and give up that. And, well, okay. So I was trying to figure out how to present Prabhupada to a non-devotee audience in a way that might be acceptable. And what I came up with was the work of mythologist Joseph Campbell. Joe Campbell passed away in the 1980s. Arguably the most important scholar of world mythology of recent times. Campbell studied different great epic stories from around the world, and what he discovered was that from culture to culture, from continent to continent, from people to people, there, in the great stories of these many different cultures, past and present, there seem to be certain elements that repeat themselves. There seems to be one overarching myth, what he called a monomyth, that peoples of the world all plug into somehow without ever having had a chance to discuss it in advance or work out this is how we're going to do it. There are certain things that human groupings seem to share in common. So here's a brief definition of the monomyth. A hero ventures forth from the world of common day into a region of supernatural wonder. The hero returns from this mysterious adventure with the power to bestow boons on his fellow man. The concept was introduced in his 1949 book called The Hero with a Thousand Faces. And Campbell recognized, and he admitted, this isn't a rigid template. It doesn't happen exactly like this in every culture. And there are variations. Still, there's no denying that there are some commonalities in great stories of the world. Here's another kind of schemata of the hero journey. There's a call to adventure. And by the way, who is the hero in this? In this television show back here with, that's Bill Moyers on the left, Moyers asks Joe Campbell, is the hero journey something that's reserved only for the great names of history? You know, Ulysses and Joan of Arc and, Jason and the Argonauts and, Arjuna of the Bhagavad Gita and, Martin Luther King. And is it reserved for those greats? And Joe Campbell, who could get very melodramatic on camera, his eyes kind of like got big, and he, no. He said, every one of us is on a hero journey. Every one of us in this room confronts a moment in our life when you have to make a decision. You can either go on the way you've been going on all your life and just, at Jivamukti, for the people up there, I call it the latte syndrome. You get up in the morning, your feet hit the ground, you grab your latte, and you're off and running. And basically, who you are today is basically whoever you were yesterday.